Moving into the neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start, but within days, I realized I had stepped into a battlefield governed by an HOA with a god complex. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a neatly typed notice taped to my door. Violation. Trash cans left out 5 minutes past collection time. I shrugged it off, assuming they were just strict about appearances, but that was only the beginning. The next week, I received another violation for grass length exceeding 2.5 inches, despite my lawn being perfectly manicured. At first, I found it amusing until the fines started stacking up. $100 here, $200 there, all for trivial reasons like parking slightly outside my driveway's boundary or failing to bring my mailbox to the exact shade of beige in the HOA's 47-page guidelines. My neighbors seemed terrified of the HOA's enforcer, a self-righteous man named Carl, who patrolled the streets as if he were a lawman in the Wild West. He had a clipboard, a smug smirk, and an uncanny ability to appear the moment you committed even the slightest offense. One evening, as I was washing my car in my own driveway, he approached with his usual condescending tone. "Sir, I hope you're aware that personal vehicle washing is against HOA policy due to water conservation efforts." I chuckled, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. "Are you serious?" I asked, wiping the soap suds from my hands. His eyes narrowed. "Very. You'll be receiving a fine." That's when I knew this was personal. I tried reasoning with my neighbors, asking why they allowed themselves to be bullied. "You don't mess with Carl," one elderly woman whispered, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "He's got the HOA board in his pocket. Anyone who fights back gets hit with lien threats or even forced property sales." That only fueled my resolve. What Carl and his cronies didn't know was that I wasn't just some clueless homeowner. I was a federal agent, trained in investigations and counter-surveillance. I had taken down criminals far more dangerous than a suburban dictator with a clipboard. If Carl wanted to play power games, he had no idea who he was up against. Carl and his HOA goons weren't just petty, they were relentless. Within a week, I had racked up over $1,000 in fines for offenses so ridiculous they belonged in a satire. Fence color is too dark. Front porch light is not HOA-approved wattage. American flag displayed incorrectly. That last one had me seething. I had served my country, and now some overzealous neighborhood committee was dictating how I could fly the very flag I had sworn to protect. It wasn't about community standards, it was about control. My attempts at reasoning were met with smug indifference. "If you don't like it," Carl sneered, "you can move." That was his mistake. He thought I was just another pushover. But I had spent years interrogating liars, reading between the lines, and dismantling corrupt networks. And Carl? He reeked of corruption. I started digging. Public records, HOA financial statements, board meeting minutes. I pored over everything I could find. What I uncovered was staggering. The HOA was issuing absurd fines, then funneling the money into accounts linked to board members. They were profiting off their own community, bleeding homeowners dry under the guise of neighborhood improvements that never seemed to materialize. Some of the houses that had been foreclosed for non-compliance ended up sold at suspiciously low prices to people with direct ties to the HOA leadership. This wasn't just power tripping. It was fraud. And Carl was right in the middle of it. But before I could act, they escalated. My mailbox was mysteriously knocked over. My car received a citation for illegal parking, even though it was parked in my own driveway. Then, the final straw, an official notice arrived, stating that if I didn't pay my fines within 10 days, the HOA would place a lien on my home. They were trying to force me out. I could have gone the legal route, filed complaints, hired a lawyer. But I knew how these schemes worked. They thrived on bureaucracy, dragging out cases while continuing their extortion. I needed a different approach, so I decided to make myself their worst nightmare. I installed security cameras everywhere, not just to catch vandalism but to document their every move. I started attending HOA meetings, questioning every financial decision. I let Carl see me watching him, let him feel the scrutiny, and I made sure he knew that I was just getting started. That's when they panicked. The warnings turned into threats. An anonymous letter appeared in my mailbox. Stop asking questions. My trash bins were mysteriously overturned every night. And then, one evening, just as I expected, Carl made his boldest move yet. He called in the neighborhood's so-called security force to deal with me. But what he didn't know was that I had already set my own plan in motion. If Carl wanted a showdown, he was about to get one. The night they decided to make their move, I was ready. A knock at the door came just after 8 p.m., too late for a friendly neighborhood visit. I checked my security feed and wasn't surprised to see two uniformed men standing outside, their belts weighed down with radios and batons. They weren't real cops. They were private security, hired muscle for the HOA, dressed to intimidate. One of them even had a makeshift badge clipped to his chest, as if that somehow made him an officer of the law. I took my time answering the door, letting them stew. When I finally opened it, I put on my best clueless homeowner act. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The taller one, a buzz-cut bruiser with an attitude, stepped forward. "You've been cited for multiple violations, including harassment of HOA officials. You need to come with us." I raised an eyebrow. "Come with you? Am I under arrest?" His partner, a younger guy who clearly wasn't as confident, shifted uncomfortably. "The HOA president has requested an intervention," Buzzcut continued. "We need to escort you to a meeting to discuss your noncompliance." I almost laughed. These guys thought they could strong-arm me into submission, just like they had with everyone else in the neighborhood. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "You know," I said casually, "I'd hate to waste your time, so let's clear something up. You're not police officers. You don't have arrest authority. And you definitely don't have the power to escort anyone against their will." Buzzcut's expression darkened. "We're authorized by the HOA to enforce neighborhood regulations." "Oh, really?" I said, pulling out my own badge. "Because I'm authorized by the federal government to enforce actual laws. And what you're doing, that's called unlawful detention. That's a crime." The shift in their demeanor was immediate. The younger guy visibly paled, while Buzzcut took a step back. "You're lying," he muttered. I pulled out my phone. "Tell you what, how about I call some real law enforcement and we can sort this out? I'm sure they'd love to hear why two private security guards think they can abduct a federal agent." Before I could even dial, the younger one grabbed Buzzcut's arm. "Let's go," he whispered. "This isn't worth it." Buzzcut hesitated, then shot me a venomous glare before turning away. "This isn't over," he muttered as they left. I waited until they disappeared down the street before closing the door. I had won this round, but I knew Carl wouldn't give up. He had too much to lose, and now that he knew who I was, he'd either back off or double down. I had a strong suspicion it would be the latter, and that's exactly what I was counting on, because now it was my turn to go on the offensive. Carl wasn't the type to cut his losses. I knew that the moment his security goons backed off, a man like him, drunk on power, convinced of his own untouchability, wasn't going to walk away quietly. Sure enough, the next morning, I woke up to an email from the HOA. Subject: Final warning for noncompliance. The message was pure arrogance. A formal demand that I cease my disruptive behavior, attend a mandatory compliance hearing, and pay my outstanding fines, or face immediate legal action, including a lien on my home. Carl wasn't just flexing his authority. He was making a desperate move, trying to regain control. But what he didn't realize was that I had already started pulling the strings that would unravel everything. I dug deeper. Through some well-placed contacts, I accessed financial reports, land records, and even HOA meeting transcripts. What I found was worse than I expected. Carl wasn't just issuing bogus fines. He was running a full-blown racketeering operation. The HOA had been systematically targeting homeowners, levying excessive fines, and then forcing foreclosures when people couldn't pay. And every single one of those foreclosed properties, they were sold at rock-bottom prices to shell companies that, upon further digging, were all linked back to Carl and a few select HOA board members. It was textbook fraud, and I now had the receipts. But I wasn't just dealing with a scam. I was dealing with a criminal network operating under the guise of a homeowners association. They had been running this racket for years, draining people dry while laundering their profits through fake maintenance projects and community improvement funds. The worst part? They had local officials in their pocket. That's why no one had ever successfully fought back. Complaints disappeared. Investigations stalled. Carl had insulated himself, believing he was untouchable. That's where he was wrong. I started playing mind games. I wanted Carl to know something was coming, but not what. I began attending HOA meetings, sitting silently in the back, watching. When they discussed budget allocations, I asked casual questions about expense reports. When they brought up new fines, I requested to see detailed financial breakdowns. Carl's usual smugness began to crack. He started making excuses, getting flustered, rushing through votes. He was feeling the heat, but he didn't know where it was coming from. Then I made my boldest move yet. I mailed an anonymous package to every homeowner in the neighborhood. Inside, a full breakdown of the HOA's finances, highlighting every suspicious transaction, every missing dollar, every property Carl and his associates had stolen. I didn't sign my name. I didn't have to. The documents spoke for themselves. The community was livid. At the next HOA meeting, people demanded answers. Carl stammered, deflected, tried to dismiss the accusations as misunderstandings. But then, as he was sweating in front of an angry crowd, I stood up and asked a single question. Carl, do you want to explain why 3 of the foreclosed homes on this street are now owned by an LLC registered in your brother's name? Silence. Carl's face turned ghost white. He knew he was finished. But I wasn't done yet, because now, it was time to bring in the feds. Carl must have known the walls were closing in. After the disastrous HOA meeting, he went into full damage control mode. Within 24 hours, the HOA board sent out a panicked email claiming the financial discrepancies were being reviewed and that a third-party audit would ensure transparency. A weak attempt at deflection. But the neighborhood wasn't buying it. The homeowners had seen the evidence with their own eyes. People were furious, demanding resignations, legal action, even police intervention. But I wasn't about to let Carl squirm his way out of this with half-hearted apologies and empty promises. It was time to finish what I started. By the time Carl and his cronies realized the full scope of their problem, it was too late. I had already sent my findings, every document, every fraudulent transaction, every shady property transfer, to the appropriate federal agencies. The case landed right where it needed to, with a task force that specialized in financial crimes and racketeering. And because this wasn't just a case of HOA corruption but a full-blown organized fraud operation, it wasn't going to be handled quietly. This was going to be a takedown. The first sign of trouble for Carl came in the form of a subpoena. I happened to be outside when it was served, watching from my porch as 2 federal agents approached his house. Carl tried to play dumb at first, but the second he saw the documents, his fake bravado evaporated. His hands were shaking as he took the papers, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. But there was none. Things moved fast after that. Investigators found the missing funds, traced the fraudulent transactions, and uncovered the full scale of Carl's scheme. Bank accounts were frozen. Assets were seized. Arrests were made. Carl, his brother, and multiple HOA board members were hit with charges ranging from wire fraud to conspiracy to commit racketeering. The local officials who had been covering for them, they weren't spared either. Some resigned in disgrace. Others faced their own investigations. The neighborhood finally got the justice it deserved. A court-appointed administrator took over the HOA, wiping out the fraudulent fines and reversing the illegal foreclosures. Homeowners who had been unfairly forced out were given the opportunity to reclaim their properties. The entire HOA system was restructured to ensure transparency, with new leadership elected by the people, real neighbors, not power-hungry grifters. As for Carl, he tried to cut a deal, but the evidence was overwhelming. He ended up with a hefty prison sentence. His assets forfeited to cover restitution. The last time I saw him, he wasn't the smug enforcer strutting around the neighborhood anymore. He was just another crook who got caught. And me? Well, I finally got to enjoy my home in peace. No ridiculous fines, no intimidation tactics, no power-tripping HOA overlords. Just a quiet neighborhood, the way it was meant to be. The moral of the story? If you're gonna run a scam, maybe don't try it on a federal agent. Because some of us, we don't just play by the rules. We enforce them,